We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I am joined as President Biden wraps up his second formal press conference on the eve of his second year in office by my colleague, Eddie Scarry, who's the DC columnist for us at The Federalist, also an author. Eddie, where can people go to get your books?
You can find them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or just go to eddiescarry.com, and I have links there, Eddie Scarry with 2 R's.
That's right. All right. So, Eddie, the president is still speaking. I'm literally listening to it in my other ear, and I'm listening to you in this ear. But I wanted to get your reaction to the bulk of the speech in the press conference that we've heard so far. He started off with a speech sort of touting, and I think with some very questionable claims, that he touting these victories from his time in office, and took a smattering of questions then from entirely mainstream media reporters, legacy media reporters. I think he took one from News Nation. What was your reaction to what just played out?
I mean, honestly, I was a little bit off, but I called exactly what was going to happen coming up, because there was a story in the Washington Post this morning that was just all about the crises that Biden is facing, and how it's just quoting all these Democratic officials and White House officials, administration officials saying, well, no, it's a messaging problem, and we haven't properly explained to people what exactly his accomplishments are, and how great his accomplishments are, and how much he's done for the American people, and how he's just kind of back on his heels because of COVID and yada, yada, yada. But I thought that we would probably get a story from, the New York Times or something coming up, maybe the Washington Post again, about how, well, the White House is recalibrating, and they're going to make sure that Biden goes on the road, and we got to get him out more in front of people. But he said it himself. He said he did it during his press conference, where he's saying people don't understand what was in the 2 major legislative accomplishments he has had. They don't understand how good this is going to make their lives, and how they're so much better off now already. They just don't know. It has to be explained. So he said, I'm going to go on the road to explain this. You're going to see me a lot on the road in the coming days. And just, it was just so predictable. And I think that whoever the people are at the White House who think that this is a messaging problem, and convincing the president and I guess Kamala Harris that this is just a messaging problem, I don't really care one way or the other than maybe I care about the country. But those people need to be fired, because that is not the problem. Messaging is not the problem. The policies are the problem.
Yeah, well, it gets into, so I had this moment when I was listening to the speech, and he was blaming Republicans for being obstructionists. And he said, I like Mitch McConnell, but he said, I couldn't have anticipated that the Republican Party's top priority would have been stopping everything that I want to do, which is, of course, laughable. That is what every political party, opposition party, does when another president is in office. And it's certainly what his own party did with the entire movement called resistance during the last president's tenure. But he said, he just couldn't anticipated that. And I was like, it sounds exactly like the Obama administration and Joe Biden's talking points during the Obamacare debate, when the public was like really against what was being sort of rammed through in Washington, whether or not they like it now. At the time, there was so much public opposition to it. And Democrats said, this is a messaging problem, and this is a problem of obstructionism. And then Biden himself made that parallel explicitly. He said, it reminds me of the Obamacare debate when we passed the bill, and I, implored President Obama to get out there and tell people what we had done. And he actually sort of blamed Barack Obama for not doing that, saying, he said, we just have too much stuff to do. And Biden then took the credit for having such a brilliant idea. Did it remind you of something really similar, Eddie, and the same sort of lines from the Obama administration?
Yes, no, exactly. And I think to myself, he said, I could have never expected that Republicans would have been so resistant, and yet he was there. He was vice president. He was in the White House in the Obama years, when, just as you were saying, any party that's in the minority is going, because they just believe in different things. So of course they're going to oppose his major the items on his agenda. So yeah, I think that was, I guess on the one hand, I would say disingenuous. And then on the other, I mean, we're just looking at a president who, as we're watching him, all I can think of is just like his brain, like browning over like every single day, and just like this, like the decay that's going on there. So I guess that's also a possibility. But again, I think this, as he was saying about getting, I guess another parallel would be during the 2016 campaign, when Hillary Clinton's numbers were basically deadlocked with Trump's. You had these stories in the New York Times and Washington Post where different political operatives within the Hillary campaign were telling them, well, we're going to try and show her softer side. We're going to get her in front of the press to show her softer side. We're going to make her more available, as if that is the problem. I mean, if there is a problem, is we're seeing too much of these people. We're seeing too much Anthony Fauci on TV. We're seeing too much Kamala Harris. Jen Psaki is just absolutely, I guess I'll just use the word unlikable. And then if were
you going to say shrill?
If the fix is we're going to put the president himself and he can explain it. No, I mean, people feel and see what's happening at their grocery stores, at their gas stations. They see the numbers of COVID. He actually said during his press conference that we're in a better place than we've ever been with COVID. And then I just went to just real quick to the New York Times, their COVID page that they update basically every single day about what the case counts are and what the deaths are, the hospitalizations, where the hot spots are. And the summary is absolutely devastating. You could never, if you would have told voters in 2020 that come 2022, this would be the summary of where we are with COVID, I don't think that there would have been this great enthusiasm to get rid of Trump, because what you're reading looks like it's worse than what we were reading in 2020, because actually it said that the hospitalizations are at the worst they've ever been. There's still like 1,500 people dying every single day. The daily average of case counts is, I think now we're at like quadruple what it was at its highest point under Trump. I mean, for him to say that we're in a better place than we've ever been, I mean, it's pretty shocking. I mean, but the answer is we need to get him out there in front of people and to talk and explain actually how good things really are. It's just kind of bizarre. It really is.
Well, and I think that was really the rationale for the press conference, and we should, and we will, because it's Eddie's specialty, get into the media question here, and I have clips pulled, so we'll literally get into that. But before we do, I want to Eddie also point out that President Biden has had to your point, he doesn't do a lot of talking back and forth to the press. He doesn't do a lot of appearances, but that they are trotting him out now on the eve of his inaugural anniversary. It's really interesting because it reminds me of Glenn Youngkin and the way that there was this fleeting moment of self-reflection on CNN in the hours after Glenn Youngkin shocked everybody on their airwaves by winning this blue state as a red governor. They had this fleeting moment of self-awareness saying, maybe we're doing something wrong, just like, those early hours of the morning after Trump won in 2016. And then suddenly the next day they had clung to a new narrative, which is that the country is too racist, that the Democrats have a messaging problem. Their Republicans are just so awful. And it does seem to be in the speech, which by the way is still going on. I am continuing to listen to it in my other ear. They cannot concede that they are not virtuous at every step of the way, that they are not superheroes. It's just that the country, as Paul Begala said, Democrats don't have a leadership problem, they have a followers problem, that they are not in the wrong. And I think that's what happened in the messaging of Biden's speech today. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, there was a part where I was so ready for him to say it. I was shocked that he didn't say it, but he led into it about just how he said something like the best way to fix all the problems that we're seeing with the economy and the supply shortage and all of that. I thought for sure he was going to say is to get your booster and to get vaccinated, because I think that is something that is a running thing with this administration, with Democrats, with the media. Whereas the reason why this pandemic is enduring and we're not seeing a complete turnaround, the complete turnaround that he promises is actually your fault. It's actually your fault that you haven't gotten a vaccine. It's actually your fault you haven't gotten 4 shots at this point, over a vaccine that we were led to believe was, close to 100% effective. But he ended up saying, well, no, it's because we haven't passed my Build Back Better plan. That is just, it would compound the problem by, I think, like 4-fold or something. The problem is not that the government isn't spending enough money. The reason why we are where we are is because the government spent so much money. We had trillions of dollars spent under President Trump, which was for the purpose of keeping people home and out of work. And I understand that initially, in the initial months of the pandemic, it was, we need to figure this out and see, like, how do we treat this? How do we understand this? But when we got to a year into it and we realized who this was affecting and what the best courses were to treating it for people, that excuse kind of went out the window. And yet Biden said, well, no, I still want my bite at the apple, which was to dump $2 trillion more into the economy. And now the answer is more welfare, which is multi-trillions dollars more. Well, that'll really cool inflation, I'm sure. So, just these endless excuses that never really seem to make any sense. It's either we're not spending enough money, or it's your fault. It's your fault for not understanding how great things are and how good of a situation we're actually in. It's just kind of it's absurd.
Yeah. And so he's saying to Peter Doocy right now as we're talking, fire away. You always ask me the nice questions. And on that, given exactly what Eddie just said, I think is a good segue into playing the first question that Zeke Miller of the Associated Press asked of during the press conference. He was the first reporter Joe Biden called on. He started with a scripted list of reporters to call on, almost all of whom were from legacy media outlets, NBC. I think he called on News Nation, but that was really the only non-sort of legacy outlet, New York Times, Associated Press, and now he's calling on Doocy, as we just mentioned. But here's what Zeke Miller asked right away.
You mentioned your progress on COVID-19. I'd like to ask you about some of the other issues facing your presidency. One of the defining challenges you face in the coming months is how to deliver on your promise to Americans on issues like immigration reform, gun control, voting rights, climate change. All of those right now are facing stiff, united opposition from Republicans on Capitol Hill. How far are you willing to go to achieve those promises that you made to the American people?
So as you can see there, that video was pulled by Newsbusters, and it's kind of interesting because Newsbusters pulled this moment from Zeke Miller. And what did you think of the question, Eddie? I could go either way on it.
I like the word overpromise. There was another word. Zeke Miller, the AP reporter, asked Biden if he overpromised to the American people, to the voters. There was another word that they used to use about that in the very recent past, which was, did you lie? Did you lie to the American people? That word was very in vogue up until recently. I don't know what happened, but I will credit one of the reporters in the room who, Zeke Miller right there, he just said Republicans are completely not going to move on this stuff. But there was another reporter, I forget who it was, so sorry to her in advance, but she said, you can't even get some in your own party to do the things that you promised. Right. And I thought that was, one, a really good point, two, an obvious point to make. So this whole thing of using that as an excuse that it's Republicans and Republicans, no, he can't even get people within his own party, both in the House. Let's not forget about the House. I think that was an allusion to the Senate, but there are people, the 2 senators in the Senate, but there are people in the House, Democrats in the House, who do not want to vote with some of what Joe Biden is proposing. So that excuse of it's Republicans' fault or it's the voters' fault for not understanding, all of that just kind of goes out the window when you recognize, as that reporter did, to her credit again, that there are people within his own party who do not support this stuff.
He's currently squabbling with Philip Wegman of Real Clear Politics, who once again pressed him, as did actually Kristen Welker of NBC, while we're talking about the performance of the press, which we should talk about over the course of the last year. And just today, he's sparring with Wegman right now on this question of, talking about George Wallace, talking about Jefferson Davis in his speech in Atlanta last week, where he said, and we know John Meacham wrote that according to Politico Playbook, the implication is that you are with the side of awful racists. Biden tried to clean that up when Welker first asked him the question by saying, I was saying, if you don't vote with them, you're complicit, not that you are a racist. But of course, that's not at all what he said. So, Eddie, what do you make of Biden sort of trying to clean that up in that excuse? A lot of people look back on that moment. I saw a lot of Never Trump people saying that was a real low point for his presidency, or arguing that it was a low point for his presidency. But what do you think the White House understands that?
I admittedly did not see the speeches that both Joe Biden and the vice president gave on the voting stuff. I guess what was that, on MLK Day? I did not see those speeches, but I know that they come off of the speech he gave about January 6th. They came almost back to back, and it sounds to me like they were basically the same type of speech. And what they're trying to do, what the White House obviously is trying to do, is hit those tried and true buttons with the media, which is white supremacy, Trump, racism, white nationalism, all those things that were the boogeyman of the last 4 years, or I guess 5 years, and think that that's going to win them some points and turn up their base and make people excited and get them some good press. And I suppose that it serves that purpose. But again, the press, as corrupt as it is, the national media, as corrupt as it is, they can't deny the things that their viewers, even the farthest left among them, what they feel and what they see. They can't just pay attention to January 6th for 365 days a year. You understand? So they do have to talk about, well, what's with this inflation? And even though every now and then you get a Paul Krugman column about how great inflation is, or how things actually aren't as bad as things are, they're actually good. That can't be the case year round. People understand that, no, this is really bad. And even the Rachel Maddow viewers understand that.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so I actually, for anyone listening, just took the speech out of my ear because the president just announced he was going to go for another 20 minutes. And this leads me to actually another question, Eddie, because in addition to sort of evaluating the performance of the press, which I think we're probably both in agreement is mixed, I want to talk about the performance of the president, because that's always at the front of my mind whenever Joe Biden speaks. In fact, sometimes I just need to read transcripts because it makes me so uncomfortable and sort of nervous for the country to watch him talk. And I'm not saying that I haven't had reactions like that from previous presidents, but in this particular case, it's uncomfortable because it seems he seems unwell.
And I'm not joking. I hold my breath when I watch him talk because I'm scared. And I'm not that's not me being funny. I'm just I realize that I'm not breathing.
Right. And if he goes for another 20 minutes, that's going to put him almost at 2 hours, the bulk of which would be questions. And I actually have been surprised by his performance, not to say that it's been great. He's been sort of stuttering and having very typical moments of awkward and uncomfortable silence, and all of that. But for him to go this long, I don't know the last time we've really seen him, talk for this long, especially without a script. What did you think?
Well, when he initially came out, and I have it on the TV, but I can't hear it like you were hearing it still. So I'm not even sure of the latest over the last 20 minutes or so. But he came out and seemed to have a lot more energy than what he usually has and what you might see him on another day. And that clearly is another thing where he was amped up by his White House team saying, this is what you need to do. You need to come out with energy. And there was a CNN correspondent who just before the speech, he was on Jake Tapper's show, and Jake Tapper said, well, what are we going to expect from the president today? And the CNN correspondent said, well, Democrats and White House officials expect this speech to be about reclaiming the narrative. And I guess the mindset among them is that if we can put on a good show, a good performance, and make him look like he's in any way in command of all of the things that are happening, which he has command, and they're all his fault. But if he can look strong, then this will somehow help. No, it's not going to help. People people aren't stupid. They can see everything, and no matter what good of a speech, if you're spending more at the grocery store. I mean, I am a single male. I live alone, and yet going to the grocery store, I see this stuff. Like, I go and I just spent $40 on like 6 packs of ramen and a gallon of milk. Like,
hashtag prayers for Eddie. Get this
What's
trending. Hashtag prayers for Eddie.
Yeah.
All of our thoughts and prayers are with you, Eddie. Yeah. And so I think when he was reading his script, I think he was actually worse than when he was off the cuff. But his conversations with Peter Ducey of Fox News and Philip Wegman of Real Clear Politics, he really did get fired up. And I don't know that he made a lot of sense. He sort of yelled at Phil to go back and look at what he said in Atlanta when he had been, of course, quoted perfectly accurately. And that's the side of him where he sort of vacillates between stuttering and being angry. And I'm not sure of the strategy of saying, listen, we have a lot of cleanup to do on the eve of his first anniversary, of his inaugural anniversary. His approval ratings are at very low. I mean, we're talking around 40%. We're talking lower levels than his predecessors at this point in office. He has record inflation. He's dealing with a lot of bad stuff, and bad stuff that's very easily, and I think rightfully in many cases, blamed on him. And so their strategy was to put him in front of the press for almost 2 hours. Do you think this is going to ultimately affect the president's, the public's perspective of the president in a good way or a bad way?
I think that it just looks worse and worse, and it's so obvious what they're doing to try and change the subject off of things that, if this was a period of time where COVID was on the decline, which it was from I think basically when he was inaugurated, it was on a steep downward trajectory. If it had stayed doing that, and even maybe just flatlines, and we could have got it around the 10,000 cases a day or whatever the latest lie from Anthony Fauci is about when we can go back to normal. If it had remained at the 10,000 cases per day, if inflation hadn't gotten out of control, if the Afghanistan stuff hadn't happened, if energy prices weren't insane, you could probably get some extra mileage off talking about January 6th and Donald Trump and white supremacy. But the opposite has happened. You have the out of control inflation, you have the skyrocketing energy prices, you have the again, quadruple the number of cases that happened under their peak under Trump. And yet he's still trying to change the subject. The White House is still trying to change the subject and make it about January 6th and white supremacy. Well, people are thinking, I would take a really good bet that people say, yeah, those things are bad, but when are we going to talk about how much money I'm spending and how I'm not getting ahead at all? In fact, I'm falling way behind on all this stuff, and a lot of it, the majority of it, I think, has to do with the pandemic. And yet, you're the person who said you'd get it under control, and that has not been the case at all. When people, that mileage, it's completely ran out. The mileage of January 6th and talking about Donald Trump and white supremacy. And the more they want to talk about it and the more they're trying to change the subject, the resistance, people feel that. And they're like, why aren't you giving the speech about what your plan is to address these things that you're supposed to be addressing? Donald Trump is gone. He's not in the picture anymore. He's down in Florida sending his emails all day, but we don't see those. When are you going to do the things that you said you were going to do? And the answer from the White House is, well, let's put you in front and get you angry talking about January 6th. No, that's just not going to fly.
So I was wondering what the headline would be from this. I went over to the Drudge Report. Drudge's headline right now is about Putin's war games. That's what it said. And then it says Biden predicts incursion. And interestingly, I did think that what Biden said about Vladimir Putin and the situation between Russia and Ukraine would be the headline, because he did indeed predict an incursion, as Tom Rogan did on this podcast last week, as analysts have predicted. But coming from the president of the United States, it obviously carries more weight. And it made people nervous in a way that reminds me of the way people got nervous, people who defend Biden got nervous when Donald Trump would sort of riff on foreign policy. But it seemed in this case that Biden's imprecision in discussing his relationship with Putin, he kept pausing awkwardly and saying, I'm not sure how to say this in public, how I can say this in public. It was really weird. Eddie, did you see echoes of this sort of maybe double standard, or echoes that maybe add up to a double standard in the way that Biden handled those questions and that issue?
I would say that the part that most stuck out to me during that portion, the Russia portion, Ukraine and all that of his press conference, was when he said something like, Russia has never had the sanctions on them as under my administration. And I thought that's something Trump would say. And it was very, and I know that there were tough sanctions on Russia under Trump, and yet still we haven't really seen a change of action on behalf of Russia. So I would wonder, where is the press in terms of the hair on fire over Russia that we saw for so many years, and the lack of, they felt there was a lack of confrontation with Russia, that there should be basically another war. Are they going to talk about Biden in that same way? Thus far, they have not, and things are getting way worse in terms of Russia escalating the tensions with Ukraine. So yeah, it would be nice if the press, I don't want to see another war. I hope that that's not the case. I think that that's the last thing we need. But if you're going to handle both situations the same way, Biden is not doing very good when it comes to Russia.
Yeah, and I do think that maybe the headline that comes out of all of this, and it does show, to the last question I asked you, the lack of wisdom, I think, in the strategy of saying, well, let's just get the president out there and put him in front of reporters for 2 hours to maybe clean some of this stuff up, and to prove that he's willing to talk to the press, because that was starting to build. Questions about his willingness to take questions from the press was really starting to build. So, Eddie, do you have, a take on ultimately why the past year for Joe Biden, this is actually a true fact. Jill Biden has done more press conferences than Joe Biden this year. I think it was 23 to 22, or maybe she's just one behind him. Either way, it's really close. And that puts him way below his, I think, 3 last predecessors. And yet today he's out there for 2 hours. So how do we sort of square this circle? Is his media strategy coherent? What does it mean?
No, I think that it is these I had a tweet about this earlier. It's these communications majors who never had a real job outside of political campaigns, and they saw on some show where you will tell the person, get out in front of this, or we just need to put you in front of the public more, and that's the advice that it's the same thing that goes to that these companies do, these the big companies, Nike, where it's they have these young people working and running things who they see on social media. Oh, people are posting black squares. We've got to do that now, and that will change things, and that will make things better. It's never a good idea. It's usually never the person, in this case Joe Biden, it's never really their choice, because you would have to understand this is not a messaging issue, and yet they seem to want to believe this is a messaging issue. The problems that we're seeing happening with inflation at the border, with COVID, with the lockdowns, with schools, all of that stuff is policy related. And the problem that this administration has is that they're doing the things that they said, and they're getting the outcomes that would come from the things they said. To not have those outcomes means to do the opposite. But to do the opposite means to completely change the promises they made and the things they said. And that is just why they can't do it, because then it looks either like they're lying, or they weren't confident in the things they said, or they were just completely wrong. They don't want to do that. So, if there was any real action from this administration and from this president to see a different result than what we're seeing, it wouldn't be about getting Joe Biden on the road, as he said during his press conference. I'm going to be out on the road explaining to people how great things really are. No, it would be completely changing, and in fact doing the opposite of the biggest policy decisions that he's made.
We also saw something I think major from him, which was Biden saying that the next election, and he used this word twice when pressed by reporters, could easily be illegitimate. And those were in response to questions. I don't think he said that of his own volition, but when pressed on whether the next election could be illegitimate, he said, yeah, it could easily be illegitimate. He said the increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in proportion to not being able to get these reforms passed. So not only is there, you being George Wallace on the line, there's also you being an authoritarian for opposing huge expansions of voting. And that's another sort of, he's going down the exact same road that he did. But Eddie, we're a year in. My question for you, looking back on moments like this voting reform, which does kind of seem dead, Build Back Better seems dead. Inflation is up. His approval rating is at a low, and a historic low, and by some measures. So what is where does Biden stand as we wrap up here going into year 2?
Where does he stand? I mean, well, we already knew that. First of
all, I'm glad he is standing.
Well, we already knew, and just history tells us that the opposing party, the minority party, takes back Congress, takes back the House at the very least. What I did not foresee was the opening that Donald Trump sees, which is to be, I think, in history, the first president to lose a second term, but could possibly come back and win a second term after he's been voted out of office. I did not foresee that opening taking place, but I do believe there is an opening there. I think he sees it. I think that's why he's kind of everywhere, why Donald Trump is everywhere. And for that to have happened, and for the last president, Donald Trump, to have gone out the way he did under the circumstances he did, there should never, I can't imagine having ever seen an opening for him. But things are just so bad. Things are so bad under Joe Biden. And things that were, I believe, and I think I could prove it, completely avoidable. But all the things that he has done has just created this massive opening for even someone like Donald Trump to come back and say, I can do this, and it be real. Like, I think he could do it. I think that is the state of Joe Biden's going into his second year.
And it takes us back full circle to the Zeke Miller question that we talked about a couple of times, which I think overpromising is a very fair criticism of Biden, but it's a surface level criticism of Biden. It's very much the sort of like media criticism of Biden that this is the worst they can muster. And it is bad. He did overpromise. He talked a huge game on COVID. But the reason he wasn't able to deliver, it's not just because, oh, wow, this stuff is really hard, it turns out. It's because there was a failure of leadership. And to wrap up, I'll read a tweet from our senior editor, our fearless senior editor, Molly Hemingway, who said, "We need so much more diversity of thought in the White House press corps. Having roughly 4 sane people and a room of delusional people is not helping anyone, not the country, but not even the Democratic Party." The Democrat Party, as Molly wrote. And I think that's a good place to leave this, Eddie. And I'm sure you agree with that. And we tried to do 2 things here to criticize or analyze Biden and to analyze the media. So to do a little criticism on both levels. And my apologies for stuttering through some of it, sort of like the president. I was trying to listen and trying to bring everybody the most up-to-date news about what the president was saying in this conference that went way longer than I certainly expected it to. I think, judging by Eddie nodding, then he expected it to go as well. So we appreciate everybody tuning in. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Well, you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. We will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.